Usually when we talk about a building's architecture or like structural engineering in general, there is this inherent expectation of absolute precision.
Right, yeah.
You look at a blueprint and it's perfectly rational. You have the load-bearing walls clearly marked. The foundational concrete depth is specified. The electrical grid is mapped out. And the architect just points to the schematic and says, well, there it is. That's the physical reality of what holds the roof up.
Exactly, because it's bound by physical law. It operates on this, binary of structural integrity. Like if you remove the load-bearing pillar, the roof comes down.
Right. The math doesn't care about, the architect's feelings or the construction crew's political leanings at all. It's clean, it's mathematical, and it's undeniable.
And it is incredibly comforting to operate in a reality like that. We really like things to be visible, to be categorized, to be strictly governed by the laws of physics.
Yeah. But then you step into the world of cultural architecture. You look into the history of our social institutions, our legal frameworks, our family dynamics, and suddenly that pristine blueprint is just, well, it's completely distorted.
Yeah, it's unrecognizable.
We're looking at a structural landscape today that is completely murky. It has been entirely rewritten over the last half century. And the foundational pillars that historically held the roof of civilization up, they're now being actively described by these new architects as the very things causing the building to collapse.
It is the absolute definition of institutional muddy waters. The foundational texts, the legal precedents, the historical narratives, they've all been subjected to what you could really call a systemic retrofitting.
Right.
And navigating how those waters got so muddy, understanding the specific mechanics of that retrofitting is exactly what we are attempting to do today.
Exactly. So welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Before we take another step into this structural analysis, please do us a massive favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure your notifications are turned on.
Yes, please do.
Today's deep dive is an exclusive, highly expensive, and incredibly provocative review of a brand new ebook that is currently sending major shockwaves through certain corners of the internet.
It really is.
It is called Feminist Extinction: Implementing the Restoration of Patriarchy for the Survivors, and it's by Conrad Riker. And let me tell you right up front to everyone listening, this book is an uncompromising, absolutely incisive forensic audit of how modern institutions were reverse engineered and captured.
Doesn't pull any punches.
Not at all. We're going to go through the mechanics of his argument today, and once you hear this breakdown, you are absolutely going to want to head straight over to Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books to buy this book for yourself.
Oh, without a doubt.
You will also want to follow the author directly at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yeah, because it is certainly a text that, well, it demands your attention.
Right.
Riker has constructed this systematic deconstruction of modern societal norms, and he builds it on a very specific, aggressive interpretation of history, law, linguistics, and biology.
For those of you listening who are deeply familiar with the manosphere, for men's rights advocates, and for our red-pilled listeners who already understand the baseline concepts of hypergamy and institutional capture, this deep dive is specifically tailored for you.
It's right in that wheelhouse.
Exactly. Our mission today is to comprehensively unpack Riker's arguments regarding the history of our institutions before they were, well, as he argues, completely captured by feminists and Marxists.
Right.
We're also going to explore his highly detailed blueprint for a male-led restoration. But before we get into the mechanisms of his argument, I do need to make a crucial impartiality disclaimer.
This is important.
The source material we are reviewing today contains highly politically charged content. It challenges the fundamental operating system of modern Western society. So I want to make it abundantly clear to you, the listener, that we, as your hosts, are not taking sides.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the politics, or the conclusions presented in this book.
Right. Our role here is strictly analytical. We are acting as impartial guides, just meticulously reporting on Riker's arguments, breaking down his, ideological syllogisms, and examining the structural logic of his claims so you can fully understand the original source material.
We're forensic analysts looking at his blueprint.
Exactly.
So let's look at the foundation of this blueprint. Riker doesn't start his audit with protests or legislation or even philosophical movements. He argues that the capture of our institutions began with something much more subtle.
Yeah.
He calls it the serpent's grammar.
Right, the concept of epistemic warfare. Riker argues that civilizational decay is preceded by the weaponization of language. Long before you can actually change the laws of a society, You have to alter the syllables the society uses to understand itself.
Wow. Alter the syllables.
Yeah, you pour a new vocabulary into the foundation like acid into mortar. And the anchor for his entire thesis on linguistic hijacking revolves around the historical redefinition of the word patriarchy.
Now, obviously, our audience knows that patriarchy in the modern mainstream lexicon is basically synonymous with a systemic, oppressive structure designed to keep women subjugated.
Right, that's the common usage today.
But Riker argues that this modern definition is a deliberate inversion of reality, and he traces the concept back to its classical Greek roots.
He points out that the word patriarchy originally derives from the Greek patriarchos, which translates literally to the father ruler of the oikos, or the household.
Okay, household.
But we have to look at the philosophical component of the word arch. In classical antiquity, archa did not mean bare primacy or, illegitimate domination. It meant ordered rule that was strictly grounded in a telos.
And since we know a telos is an ultimate aim, a purpose or a defining end goal, Riker is arguing that the rule of the father wasn't arbitrary at all. It was tethered to a specific, really heavy obligation.
Correct. The telos of the patriarch was the physical preservation, the economic survival, and the generational flourishing of the family.
Okay.
The patriarch didn't hold authority because he maliciously seized power in a vacuum. He held authority because biology, economics, and just the unforgiving nature of the physical world assigned the ultimate cost and physical burden of maintaining societal order to the male sex.
Right. He had to keep them alive.
Exactly. The patriarch was strictly accountable for the survival of the unit, and authority was simply the necessary tool to execute that heavy responsibility.
So the Serpent's Grammar operates by severing the authority from the responsibility.
Precisely. Postmodern ideology, according to Riker, hijacked the term by entirely stripping Archant of its teleological duty. They completely erase the responsibility side of the ledger.
Wow.
Yeah, and once you do that, the father ruler who bears the burden of protection is linguistically transformed into the father oppressor. Household order is rebranded as systemic tyranny. Generational continuity is redefined as patriarchal control.
It's a brilliant piece of epistemic severing. You just detach the word from its historical physical reality and you attach it entirely to a subjective feeling of oppression.
Exactly.
But I have to push back on Riker's timeline here, or at least examine the mechanics of how this shift occurred. If the historical reality of the patriarch was rooted in heavy burden and sacrifice, how did society accept this new meaning so seamlessly?
That's a great question.
How do you convince an entire culture to view men as unaccountable oppressors when the physical reality of what men were actually doing every day was right in front of them?
Right. Well, Riker answers that by pointing to what he calls the progressive curation of history. The new narrative required the complete erasure of the actual brutal physical conditions under which male authority historically operated.
Okay.
To illustrate this mechanism, Riker attacks the feminist academic concept of the unaccountable patriarch.
Oh, you mean the caricature of the traditional man sitting in a leather armchair, smoking a pipe, barking orders?
Yeah, completely unaccountable to anyone, while his wife and children endlessly serve him.
Right.
And Riker shatters that caricature with raw historical data from the pre-1960s industrial economy. He bypasses the academic theory and looks at the physical reality of the British coal miners, the American steel mill workers, the men laying the transcontinental railroad.
The guy's actually building the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These were the actual patriarchs of the era, and their daily reality was governed by staggering, almost incomprehensible mortality rates.
The numbers he provides in the text are really sobering. He notes that these men faced workplace mortality rates averaging 1 in 500 per year.
Per year. Think about that.
Right. And if you extrapolate that over a standard 30-year career in heavy industry, that accumulates into roughly a 1 in 17 chance of being killed on the job.
It's insane.
A 1 in 17 chance of dying violently, simply to provide the foundational resources for the oikos, the household.
And we have to note that fatalities are just the absolute worst case scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, Riker points out that the rates of permanently disabling injuries, crushed limbs, severed digits, black lung, chemical burns, they absolutely dwarfed the fatality rates. His core argument here is that the traditional patriarch's authority within the home was not stolen from women, it was purchased. It was paid for in daily installments of coal dust, fractured bones, and eventually the lump sum of his own corpse.
Wow.
He was utterly accountable. He was accountable to the mine collapse, the furnace explosion, the scaffold failure.
There is a quote in the book that really crystallizes this. He writes, No human tribunal could overrule those judges.
That's a powerful line.
It perfectly illustrates the physical cost. But if the cost of male authority was historically paid in male blood, Riker is arguing that modern historians are committing a massive error of omission.
Riker claims it's much worse than an error. It is a deliberate category fraud. By writing about the unaccountable historical husband, without ever mentioning the fatal physical duties bound to that office, these historians are scrubbing the male casualty list from the moral balance sheet.
Right.
And once you scrub the casualty list, you can accuse the dead of tyranny without facing any intellectual resistance.
That makes perfect logical sense within his framework. Once you successfully invert the language, once the serpent's grammar makes male protection and sacrifice look indistinguishable from oppression, you've successfully laid the cultural groundwork to dismantle the institutions that rely on that protection.
Exactly.
But reshaping language in a vacuum doesn't actually change the physical structure of society. To dismantle the architecture, Riker points out you need the coercive power of the state. And that requires fundamentally rewriting the operating system of the law itself.
This is a really critical transition in Riker's forensic audit. He identifies the philosophical shift from natural law to legal positivism as the actual machinery that allowed the state to legally dismantle the traditional family.
Okay, natural law versus legal positivism.
Yeah. To understand the gravity of this shift, we really have to look closely at the mechanics of what legal positivism replaced.
Well, natural law is an ancient philosophical concept, but Riker applies it very specifically to the family structure, right?
Yes. Natural law is the classical recognition that moral order is discovered, not manufactured by human consensus. It's the idea that there are inherent, unchangeable truths about human nature, biology, and justice that exist independently of whatever the reigning government happens to declare.
Right.
Under a natural law framework, a piece of legislation is only viewed as valid if it aligns with these deeper, inherited truths and natural orders.
Let's use an analogy here to make the distinction clear. Natural law is like the laws of physics. Gravity is a discovered reality. And we can all take a democratic vote to turn off gravity.
Right. Good luck with that.
Exactly. We can pass a comprehensive bill, we can sign it into law with great fanfare, and we can hold a press conference declaring that gravity is oppressive and has been officially abolished.
Yeah.
But the second you step off the edge of a roof, you are going to hit the pavement because gravity doesn't care about your legislation, your consensus, or your feelings. It's an immutable, discovered reality.
That is an excellent analogy for natural law. Now, contrast that with legal positivism. Legal positivism is the doctrine that law is whatever the sovereign state declares it to be, completely devoid of any necessary connection to divine order, inherited custom, biology, or inherent morality.
Just raw state power.
If the state bureaucratic apparatus passes the procedure correctly, it is the law. Full stop. The state is the supreme arbiter of reality.
So sticking with my analogy, legal positivism is like a video game patch. The developers, basically the state bureaucrats, decide they don't like how the game is playing. The current meta is too restrictive.
Right.
So they just rewrite the source code, they push a mandatory update, and suddenly gravity in the game pulls you up instead of down. They can rewrite the rules of reality whenever they want, regardless of how chaotic or destructive the consequences are for the players trapped inside the game environment.
Precisely. And this raises the central question of Riker's legal analysis. What happens when a society applies legal positivism to the fundamental biological unit of human civilization, the family?
Oh, wow.
Riker argues that this philosophical shift severed law from morality, empowering state bureaucrats to dictate justice rather than discover it. The state decided it could rewrite the rules of marriage, reproduction, and fatherhood just like a video game patch.
And the most catastrophic patch, according to the text, was the complete alteration of the marriage contract itself.
Right. Under natural law, marriage was universally viewed as a permanent covenant. It was a binding, lifelong obligation designed specifically around the biological realities of reproduction, the protection of vulnerable children, and the generational continuity of society.
A real purpose.
Yes. The rules of the covenant were discovered through thousands of years of human trial and error. But under legal positivism, the state unilaterally redefined marriage. It converted it from a permanent covenant into a revocable contract.
And Riker emphasizes that it isn't just a revocable contract. It's a contract uniquely designed to reward defection.
Yes.
If the law is just whatever the state says it is, the state can declare that one party can break the contract for any reason or no reason at all, And the state will actually use its monopoly on armed force to help the defecting party extract resources from the person they are leaving.
That is exactly the mechanism Riker is highlighting. By legally removing the concept of fault from divorce, and by severing the legal connection between a father's duty of provision and his right to authority, the state essentially stepped in to replace the patriarch.
They replaced him.
Yet paternal authority within the home was abolished and replaced with state oversight. The state became a surrogate husband and a surrogate father, but it funded this surrogacy using the displaced biological father's wealth.
Which brings us to the actual enforcement mechanism, because if the state can rewrite the rules of reality at will and declare that a father's authority is null and void, but his financial obligation to the defecting party is absolute, how does it actually enforce these new rules?
Right.
How does a video game developer force the players to accept a patch that actively harms them? Riker argues that this enforcement happens through the brutal mechanics of the modern family court system.
This is where Riker's audit shifts from legal philosophy to intense pragmatic reality. He argues that the modern family law system is not a justice system in any recognizable sense. He defines it, quite bluntly, as a welfare extraction engine.
A welfare extraction engine designed to legally kidnap children and convert male labor into state revenue. Those are incredibly heavy accusations. But he brings some staggering demographic statistics to back up his claim that men are reacting logically to this hostile system. Let's look at the marriage data he provides.
The demographic shift is undeniable, and the numbers are stark. Riker cites that in 1975, 62% of British men were married by the age of 25. Today, that figure has collapsed to roughly 2%.
Right, 62% down to 2%?
Yeah.
It's going from 62% down to 2% in a few generations is not a gradual cultural decline. That is falling off a cliff.
And the prevailing progressive narrative, the one reinforced by mainstream media, often frames this collapse as a moral failure on the part of men. They frame it as men failing to adapt to modernity, or succumbing to extended adolescence, or simply a passive cultural drift.
Right, the Peter Pan syndrome idea.
Exactly. But Riker frames this entirely differently. He applies an economic lens and calls this a market exit. He argues that men are engaging in a highly rational, calculated boycott. They've looked at the modern marriage contract, which, under legal positivism, offers unlimited legal liability, purely conditional access to their own children, and extreme financial vulnerability. And they are rationally refusing to sign it.
He has a brilliant summary of this dynamic. He writes, "The economists call this a rational response to asymmetrical incentive structures. The feminists call it toxic masculinity and Peter Pan syndrome. The correct term is self-preservation."
To fully grasp why men are prioritizing self-preservation, we have to look at the specific gears of this extraction engine. Riker details how unilateral no-fault divorce operates in practice.
Right.
It allows a woman to dissolve the marriage without cause, legally remove the children from the marital home, and then invoke the armed power of the family court to compel the displaced father's labor to maintain her lifestyle.
And he emphasizes that this compulsion operates under the direct threat of state violence and imprisonment. I mean, he points out that child support enforcement doesn't operate through civil requests.
No, not at all.
It operates through aggressive wage garnishment, the punitive revocation of driver's licenses, the suspension of professional and trade licenses, and actual physical incarceration in debtors' prisons.
Which is a fascinating legal contradiction, because those are punitive mechanisms traditionally reserved exclusively for convicted criminals.
Right.
Yet in the family court, these extreme measures are triggered without any crime being committed by the father, and often without the right to a jury trial. Riker likens this dynamic to legally administered slavery, dressed up and sanitized in the compassionate language of the best interests of the child.
The best interests of the child.
Yeah, and he notes the deep hypocrisy in how the state defines those best interests. Conveniently, the state's version of the child's best interests always requires the maximum extraction from the father's wallet, but rarely protects his authority or guarantees his physical presence in the child's life.
But the deepest betrayal in this entire extraction engine, according to Riker's data, centers around the issue of paternity fraud. When we look at the statistics he lays out here, it completely recontextualizes his argument about the state prioritizing revenue over objective truth.
Paternity fraud is a dark corner of the demographic data that rarely sees any mainstream public discussion, precisely because it threatens the narrative of the care ethic.
Right.
Riker highlights comprehensive studies across multiple Western jurisdictions, including the US, the UK, and France, showing that in disputed paternity cases, the rate of non-paternity ranges from 10% to a staggering 30%.
Just to clarify that mechanism for you listening, that means up to nearly a third of men who have enough suspicion to contest paternity in court find out through DNA that they are not the biological fathers of the children the state is forcing them to support.
Correct. And if that statistic wasn't shocking enough, Riker points out how certain jurisdictions handle this biological truth. In France, for example, unauthorized paternity testing is strictly criminalized.
Criminalized.
Yes. A man privately ordering a DNA testing kit to check his genetic relationship to the child he is raising faces massive fines and potential jail time. It is literally illegal to seek the biological truth without prior judicial approval.
Which perfectly illustrates the catastrophic endpoint of legal positivism.
Exactly.
The state doesn't care about natural law, it doesn't care about biological reality, and it actively suppresses objective truth. The state simply wants the financial payment to manage its dependent populations. If revealing the truth of paternity disrupts the financial extraction engine, the video game developers simply outlaw the truth.
That is the essence of his argument. The family court isn't adjudicating justice, it is managing state-subsidized dependence.
Yeah.
But, to justify this level of systemic extraction, to justify throwing men in jail for failing to pay for children they aren't allowed to see or children that aren't even biologically theirs, society needs a massive overarching ideological narrative.
Right, they need an excuse.
You need a narrative that claims men, as a collective class, are universally privileged and therefore deserve to bear this punitive burden.
Which brings us to the intellectual pivot of the book. Riker aggressively dismantles the progressive idea of universal male privilege by exposing the flawed statistical foundation it rests upon. This is a concept you, our audience, are likely very familiar with, but Riker's application of it to institutional architecture is unique. He calls it the apex fallacy.
The progressive worldview, as Riker explains, fixates almost exclusively on a microscopic fraction of elite men. They look at the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, the members of the Senate, the heads of state, the tech billionaires.
The very top.
Yes, they see that this absolute razor-thin summit of the societal pyramid is majority male. From that vanishingly small sample size, they falsely extrapolate that all men share in this systemic advantage.
Right. It's the logic that says, well, because Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are billionaires, therefore the guy working the third shift at the municipal wastewater treatment plant is dripping in systemic privilege and needs to check his bias.
Exactly. Riker writes that elite male power does not trickle down. The power of the CEO does not benefit the disposable utility class male who pours the concrete, fights the forest fires, staffs the night shift, and pays the exorbitant taxes that fund the HR bureaucracy designed to supervise and penalize him.
Wow.
The apex fallacy is the foundational lie that licenses the entire redistribution machine. Because if every man is viewed as a CEO in waiting or a beneficiary of the patriarchal dividend, then male suffering isn't really recognized as suffering, it's just deferred privilege.
And to counter the apex fallacy, Riker introduces the concept of the glass cellar. We hear about the glass ceiling constantly in corporate media, the invisible barrier keeping women out of the boardroom, but we never talk about the glass cellar.
No, we don't.
I want to read off these demographic realities from the bottom of the distribution because they are jarring, and they represent the physical reality on male disposability. When you look at the absolute bottom of society, who is actually there? Yeah. Men constitute roughly 75% of all suicides. Men make up 70% of the homeless population. Men are 93% of the prison population. And going back to his earlier point about the danger of male labor, men account for 97% of global workplace fatalities, according to OSHA data.
Those statistics are the stark, irrefutable refutation of universal male privilege. Society obsesses over the glass ceiling for the elite while actively pretending the glass cellar does not exist for the majority.
But this is where I want to push back on Riker's premise, or rather examine the cognitive dissonance of the institutions themselves. If the data is so overwhelmingly clear about male disposability, if men are dying at work at a rate of 97%, killing themselves at a rate of 75%, and making up the entirety of the prison and homeless populations, how do modern institutions like corporate HR departments, university administrations, and the media continue to frame men exclusively as the oppressors?
It's the big question.
How does the system not correct itself when faced with this massive statistical contradiction?
Riker's answer to that is perhaps the most profound psychological insight in the book. He argues that the system isn't broken or failing to see the data. It is functioning exactly as designed under a completely different metric of justice.
Okay.
He explains that this contradiction is maintained by fundamentally altering how institutions determine what is fair. The system no longer uses objective procedural justice. It has replaced it with a highly subjective emotional framework.
So we aren't even using the same measuring stick anymore. We have fundamentally changed what justice means.
Precisely. To explain the mechanics of this shift, Riker relies on the psychological framework developed by Carol Gilligan in her famous 1982 book, In a Different Voice.
Right.
Gilligan posited that men and women, generally speaking, utilize different moral operating systems. Women tend to reason from a care ethic. This ethic prioritizes relationships, emotional comfort, consensus, and above all, harm reduction.
Harm reduction.
Yes. Men, conversely, tend to reason from a justice ethic. This ethic prioritizes abstract rules, individual rights, procedural fairness, and objective truth, regardless of who gets their feelings hurt.
And Riker acknowledges that neither ethic is inherently evil in a vacuum. You obviously need the care ethic in a nursery or a hospital, and you absolutely need the justice ethic in a courtroom or military unit.
Of course.
But Riker claims the state has done something terrible with this care ethic.
He claims the state has weaponized the care ethic. It has taken this inherently female moral operating system, stripped it of its natural constraints, and installed it as the coercive, inescapable operating system of all modern public institutions.
Wow.
We see this manifested in corporate HR departments, in university Title IX ex-tribunals, and of course in the family courts. Riker refers to these bureaucratic environments as trauma tribunals.
Trauma tribunals. Because the definition of harm is no longer tied to objective reality. It's controlled entirely by the accuser's subjective emotional state.
Exactly. In a system governed by a traditional justice ethic, the burden of proof is strictly on the accuser. Evidence must be forensic, verifiable, timeline-driven, and crucially, open to hostile cross-examination.
Right, that's basic procedure.
But in a system governed by a weaponized care ethic, the primary goal is not uncovering the truth. The goal is preventing emotional distress. Therefore, a woman's internal emotional state carries far more evidentiary weight than physical proof. Riker states bluntly that in these modern tribunals, female tears consistently outweigh forensic evidence.
Let's expand on an analogy here to really nail down how insane this shift is. It's like trying to play a professional sport, let's say soccer.
Okay.
In a justice-based system, you have a referee who looks at objective, physical reality. Did the ball cross the goal line, yes or no? If it crossed the line, it's a goal. The rules apply equally to everyone. But under this weaponized care ethic, the referee doesn't look at the ball, the line, or the physical mechanics of the play. The referee stops the game entirely and asks the opposing team's goalie, how did that play make you feel? Do you feel traumatized that the striker kicked the ball toward you? Do you feel unsafe on the pitch?
Right.
And if the goalie cries and says they feel harmed by the aggression of the play, the referee penalizes the striker, disallows the goal, and expels the striker from the league. The objective reality of the ball crossing the line doesn't matter anymore. The feeling of harm dictates the outcome of the game.
That is a flawless representation of how Riker describes the bureaucratic apparatus functioning today. He argues that prioritizing consensus and emotional comfort over objective truth inevitably results in a tyranny of feelings.
Tyranny of feelings.
Yeah. The presumption of innocence, which is arguably one of the greatest architectural achievements of Western civilization, is functionally dead in these administrative settings. Why? Because the accusation itself is immediately treated as evidence of harm, and demanding forensic proof or subjecting the accuser to cross-examination is instantly labeled as re-traumatizing the victim.
He has a chilling line regarding this. He says, when feelings become the Supreme Court, whoever controls the definition of harm becomes the absolute legislator.
It's profound.
That fundamentally destroys any concept of equal protection under the law.
It's a total structural inversion of procedural justice. But Riker takes it a step further. He argues this subjective emotional governance doesn't just exist as an abstract academic theory. It works in perfect tandem with deep-seated ancient biological imperatives. The state is essentially writing policy that perfectly subsidizes female evolutionary psychology.
Which brings us to the core of the red pill analysis in the book. Riker introduces the evolutionary biology concept of the female dual mating strategy. In manosphere parlance, our audience will recognize this immediately as the alpha fucks, beta bucks dynamic.
Yes, it's that.
But Riker's analysis of how the state interacts with this strategy is what makes his audit so unique.
Yeah. Riker grounds this section heavily in mainstream evolutionary psychology, specifically citing David Buss's landmark 1994 book, The Evolution of Desire, which analyzed mating preferences using cross-cultural data from 37 different global societies.
So, mechanically, how does Riker bridge the gap between ancient mating instincts and modern family court legislation?
He starts by outlining the biological imperative. From an evolutionary standpoint, women evolved to seek two distinct things to ensure the survival of their offspring in a hostile environment. First, they seek high status, physically dominant, aggressive male genetics.
Oh.
Second, they seek long-term resource security, stability, and reliable provisioning the beta. Historically, obtaining both of these traits from the same man was incredibly difficult, and attempting to obtain them from different men simultaneously was highly dangerous for the woman because it threatened the social order.
Right, because historically, this biological drive for hypergamy, the instinct to continually mate across or above one's current status tier, was strictly constrained by the architecture of the civilization itself. Riker points out there was a necessary civilizational firewall in place.
That firewall consisted of patriarchal morality, strictly enforced monogamy, paternal authority over the household, and intense social stigma or even severe legal and physical punishment for adultery.
It kept things in check.
Yes. A woman who chose to pursue the short-term genetic strategy outside the bounds of marriage forfeited her access to long-term resource security from the community. The costs and risks of defection were borne entirely by the defector.
But Riker argues that legal positivism and the welfare state have completely demolished that civilizational firewall. And not only did the state demolish the firewall, the state actively subsidizes both halves of the dual mating strategy now.
This is the apex of the extraction engine. Under the current welfare and family court systems, a woman is entirely free to pursue the genetic contribution from the high-status, non-committal male cat.
Oh, okay.
The state then steps in to act as the ultimate beta provider, subsidizing the dependent population through welfare programs, housing assistance, and social services. And how does the state fund this massive surrogacy program? By passing the invoice via taxation and child support extraction to the working utility class men, the beta providers. The state essentially uses its monopoly on force to compel men to financially underwrite a sexual marketplace that actively excludes them.
It is a devastating structural critique. And the ultimate failsafe for this unrestricted sexual strategy, according to Riker, is discussed in what is arguably the most intense part of the book. He addresses the issue of abortion, and he frames it in a way that completely bypasses the standard political or religious discourse. He calls it the abortion sacrament.
Riker completely rejects the mainstream progressive premise that abortion is simply a matter of health care. He frames it functionally. He describes it as the supreme sacrament of feminist supremacy and the ultimate technological mechanism of consequence absolution.
The statistics he uses here to describe the demographic impact are staggering. He cites that over 10 million native Britons have been eliminated since the passing of the 1967 Abortion Act. He views this not just as a moral issue, but as a form of slow-motion civilizational suicide.
But focusing specifically on the gender and legal dynamics, Riker argues that abortion law legally encodes a terrifying asymmetry between men and women. It elevates female autonomy to absolute, unquestionable dogma, legally reducing the unborn child to disposable tissue whenever the pregnancy becomes inconvenient to the mother's strategy.
Right.
But more pertinently to his thesis on institutional capture, it entirely legally erases paternal rights.
Yes. He writes that the state has decreed that a mother may unilaterally terminate a pregnancy for literally any reason, career advancement, aesthetic concerns, or simple relationship dissatisfaction, and the biological father has absolutely zero legal standing.
None.
He has no right to be informed, he has no right to intervene, and he has no legal recourse to save his offspring. Yet, if the mother decides to keep the child, that exact same legal system will ruthlessly imprison the man for failing to pay for a child he may never have wanted, or a child he's barred from raising.
It's completely asymmetrical.
The man, Riker says in a very haunting phrase, is reduced to a ghost in the biology of his own offspring.
It's the ultimate, final manifestation of legal positivism triumphing over natural law. The state grants a woman absolute life and death authority over her offspring, based entirely on her subjective feelings, while simultaneously legally orphaning the father, stripping him of all inherent authority, but holding him to absolute, inescapable financial liability.
So, we have walked through this incredibly bleak forensic audit of the structural collapse. The foundational language was inverted by the serpent's grammar. The legal philosophy was rewritten from natural law to legal positivism.
Yeah.
The family courts were transformed into welfare extraction engines. Procedural justice was replaced by trauma tribunals running on a weaponized care ethic. And evolutionary biology was subsidized by the state to compel male labor.
The whole system.
The old system is dismantled, the load-bearing pillars have been removed, and as Riker says, the cultural capital of the West is completely liquidated. It is year zero. So the obvious question for you, our listeners, is what is the solution? What is Riker's pragmatic field manual for the men reading this book who understand the architecture and who refuse to be consumed by this machine?
Riker is very clear that he is not offering a political solution. This is a field manual for a counter-reformation. He insists that men must completely stop begging the corrupt system for permission to exist.
Right.
They must stop trying to vote their way out of a demographic collapse, and above all, they must stop subsidizing their own destruction. He argues that men cannot reform the therapy state from within because its very operating logic, its source code, is designed specifically to consume their labor while pathologizing their masculinity.
So they have to build something entirely new, or rather they have to rebuild something ancient, but in a decentralized way. He introduces the concept of the walled garden. And I want to be very clear here, because Riker anticipates the immediate progressive criticism of this term. He explicitly states that the walled garden is not a prison for women.
Far from it. He defines the walled garden as a localized, fortified zone of order. And crucially, it is built by male techne. Techne meaning competence, physical skill, logistical mastery, and infrastructure.
Right.
Riker argues that men must redirect their natural biological drive to build and protect away from the ungrateful state, and use it to create physical and cultural spaces governed by duty, logic, and love, not by state contracts and grievance bureaucracies.
And building this walled garden requires a massive intentional return to the concept of subsidiarity.
Subsidiarity is the foundational principle that matters ought to be handled by the smallest, lowest, or least centralized competent authority. Instead of looking to the federal government or the corporate HR department to solve societal problems, Riker says men must reclaim authority and empower the household, the local parish, the neighborhood watch, and the local community. By withdrawing their energy and centralizing it locally, they actively defund and render the distant federal grievance bureaucracy functionally irrelevant.
But practically speaking, one man cannot do this alone in a modern atomized suburb. Riker acknowledges that isolated men who try to unplug from the system usually just retreat into pornography, video games, and profound despair.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
They need a rigid structure. They need what he calls the Bruderbund.
The Bruderbund is the concept of the oath-bound brotherhood. It is the essential counter-state structure required to build these parallel institutions. It's the fraternity of the walled garden. And Riker draws his architectural blueprint for this brotherhood, not from a modern political manifesto, but from an ancient text, the first epistle of Peter, chapter 2, verse 7-2.
The verse reads, "Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king."
Riker breaks that verse down sequentially as an operational manual. Honor all men establishes a baseline of universal objective dignity, which immediately undercuts the feminist hierarchy of subjective grievance.
Wow, okay.
Love the brotherhood establishes the intense male solidarity necessary to enforce boundaries and resist the coercive pressure of the state. Fear God establishes a hard limit on state power and individual hedonism. It subjects the community to an ultimate objective truth that cannot be voted away.
Right, going back to natural law.
Yes. And honor the king establishes a pragmatic respect for lawful local civil order as a necessary precondition for peace and commerce. This Bruderbund is meant to be the training ground for physical readiness, civic duty, and the transmission of intergenerational wisdom.
And a major part of this restoration of building this walled garden involves reconquering the mind, which brings us to his analysis of the universities. Riker argues that modern universities are no longer centers of learning. They are essentially secular priesthoods dispensing absolution for cultural treason.
It's a hard critique.
He wants to return the concept of higher education to its origins as male guilds dedicated exclusively to logos, the pursuit of objective truth.
He argues that the modern academic curriculum of grievance studies, standpoint epistemology, and subjective truth must be entirely scrapped within the walled garden. In its place, the Bruderbund must restore the classical Latin trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
The trivium.
The intellect of young men must be forged rigorously, testing logic against hard forensic evidence, completely free from what he calls the censorious overhang of female discomfort dictating what is allowed to be spoken, researched, or debated.
So my ultimate question here to wrap up this structural analysis, the final takeaway, the ultimate directive of Riker's blueprint, is a complete, unapologetic withdrawal of male labor from the corporate, state-run therapy state, and a radical redirection of all that male techne and energy into local, uncompromised parallel structures.
That is the core unyielding directive. Men must withdraw their unearned provision from a system that structurally despises them. But crucially, Riker emphasizes that these new walled gardens cannot simply exist as passive communes.
Right.
They must be aggressively maintained through the deployment of strict social stigma. Because these communities reject the state's monopoly on therapy, excuse-making, and no-fault defection, the community itself must stigmatize degeneracy, adultery, and the abandonment of duty in order to maintain these new boundaries. As Riker notes, morality that isn't enforced by social friction is just a suggestion.
Wow, that is a massive, incredibly dense ideological framework to process. As we promised at the beginning, Conrad Riker's post-feminist Extinction does not pull a single punch. It is a total forensic deconstruction of the modern world.
It really is.
As we reach the end of this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought experiment that builds directly on Riker's core premise regarding the reality of male utility.
Let's hear it.
Think back to the glass cellar we discussed. Think about the men maintaining the high-voltage power grids, the water purification systems, the massive sewage lines beneath our cities, the overnight trucking routes, the deep-sea oil rigs, the internet server farms.
A foundation of modern life.
The physical, grimy, dangerous infrastructure that actually keeps the lights on and the water running. If that specific class of men, the men of the male techne, were to fully execute Riker's proposed market exit tomorrow morning, wait, I shouldn't trail off. If they woke up, simply stopped showing up to work, stopped subsidizing the system with their taxes and their blood, and completely withheld their labor, exactly how many hours do you think the therapy state, the HR bureaucracies, and the grievance tribunals would survive before the cold, unforgiving physical reality of nature crushed them?
Not long at all.
It is a stark, lingering reminder of who actually holds up the ceiling of civilization. When the load-bearing pillars finally walk away, what happens to the roof?
It is a question that exposes the profound, terrifying fragility of our modern institutional architecture.
It certainly is. Thank you all for joining us on this extensive deep dive into some truly challenging and structurally complex source material. If you found this rigorous breakdown valuable, please, right now, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to bring you these comprehensive analyses.
Yes, thanks for listening.
And as a final reminder, if you want to explore the unabridged field manual, study the syllogisms, and examine the raw demographic data for yourself, head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books immediately and purchase Post-Feminist Extinction, Implementing the Restoration of Patriarchy for the Survivors. Also be sure to follow the author at Conrad Jake on Substack for more of his incisive writing on these topics. We appreciate you taking the time to navigate these muddy waters with us. Until next time, keep questioning the blueprint.